few kind of things to maybe touch on. One, about really thinking about the site context and how people go through a process of learning and understanding what that site context is. The relationship between the artist and the commissioning agency or the community that has invited them, and how is that relationship or partnership shape the project, the limitations of those projects as well. And then also, what is the public dialogue that the artist is hoping to provoke or engender, and how is that dialogue structured or unstructured, and how is that thought about in terms of the public sphere? So, and then in the context of this particular panel, like, is there a particular cultural context that is needed, or knowledge that is needed to decode aspects of that work, and to actively, for the viewer to participate? Is there something that needs to be known culturally? And then, of course, there's the idea of what a public project is, and then the reality of that public project, and to talk a little bit about how those things might be different and the reception aspect of it. So those are the kind of framing questions that we are going to be discussing at this panel right now. And we're going to start with a joint presentation by Dia Vidge and Tom Finkelpearl, who, of course, was the former director of the Queens Museum and is now the head of the Department of Cultural Affairs for the City of New York. Dia also is a former employee of the museum who is now at the Department of Cultural Affairs. I won't read the bios for time, but we're going to be... Huh? Of course. You can't say that a lot of the way that the museum engages the public has to do with Tom's leadership and legacy here, and we hope that we are still continuing that trajectory that was started under his vision. And I think also what I've asked them to present is how artists are working in public agencies. It's a new residency program that Tom started, and actually was inspired by Merle Lederman-Ukeles, who just had an exhibition here, and we're seeing how that is flowing and engaging with not just those agencies, but then how the artist is engaging the public and being a kind of conduit between the public that is being served by those agencies and those agencies. So, first slide is coming.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Prerna. So I wanted to just briefly talk about something that's almost so fundamental, it's almost invisible, which is the public relationship between this museum and the community and Corona specifically. And it really kind of started when about 14 years ago I hired somebody named Jayashree Abichandani. And what the difference between Jayashree and other folks maybe that worked at the museum was going from a kind of connection to the museum model to activism. To have activists on the staff was something that really was different and fundamentally different. So I think Jayashree brought a kind of spirit of activism that hasn't never gone back at this museum. So one of the first things that Jayashree did was start this youth leadership. This picture was taken right here, or that diagonal, right? Jayashree, remember that picture? So this was a youth leadership program. It was funded by the Ford Foundation. And then Jayashree said, we need to hire somebody to run this thing, and that was Prerna. So Prerna and Jayashree then kind of began to infuse another activist, somebody coming out of activism, coming out of art activism, etc., infused our relationship to our neighbors with a different kind of idea of what it meant to be connected to the community. So I always talk about the difference. The word outreach means there's something out that you're reaching to. Outreach is a model that a lot of museums use. Engagement is a completely different model. So one of the things that we began to do a lot of is to do programming in a local public space. That local public space is called Corona Plaza. And I don't know, by now, the museum must have done hundreds of those engagements. And what's going on in this picture is in the foreground, actually below the foreground is kind of a hipstery project called Uni, which is a contemporary, engaged, socially engaged art project. In the middle ground is a dance performance by a group that I'm sure Prerna would be able to identify, who are called, do you remember it?
The Aztec group?
Yeah, it's an Chichimeca, the Aztec group from here, from Queens. And then behind that are a series of tents in which people can engage things like, social services, like how to sign up for low-cost health care, how to get immigration rights information. So it's a combination of sort of straight-up activism and community public art, meaning public art that's coming from something that's right here, that's indigenous at some level, doubly indigenous. So I just want to say that these were lessons that were infused into the museum by Prerna and Jayshree, and definitely some other people, but fundamentally by them. So then, later on, I had it's almost embarrassing to say, we started something like a diversity internship. And that diversity, that's embarrassing to say, right? But it was true, we did it, and we hired a bunch of people under that, and one of them was named Dia Vij, and one of them is now a chief curator out in LA. What's Jamila doing? Santa Monica Museum, whatever. So we had a bunch of people coming through here. Fabulous, what's that?
ICALA.
ICALA, Jamila James. So we had an incredible group of people flowing through that. And then at a certain point we said, oh my God, we got to hire Dia. So we hired her, and she was a fantastic staff member here. And so when I went over to the Cultural Affairs Department, the one person I pulled with me to help us with social media and then with this artist in residence is Dia. So Prerna made one mistake in this, her introduction. Really, the Public Artist in Residence program was inspired by Merle Youkilis, but it's not me, it's actually Shirley Levy and Dia Vij who are running that ship. So now, to talk a little bit about that, here is Dia.
Dia!
So as Tom said, and under Tom, we launched a Public Artist in Residence program in 2015, inspired by the work of Merle Latterman Youkilis, who's been the artist in residence with the Department of Sanitation since 1977, and she actually named this program. And I just want to start by saying, fundamentally, this program, the impetus for this is that we believe that artists are creative problem solvers. And we're really looking at how artists can work inside city systems to affect change and address pressing civic challenges from the inside. So while this isn't a particularly South Asian program, my own South Asianness has everything to do with the way that I approach it. I consider myself firmly rooted as well in these fields of art and activism. I have very little time. Okay. I kind of consider my personal politics when I run this program, and I think in opposition to the anti-blackness and classism and misogyny of the Indian communities that I grew up in Connecticut, but I also have a deep appreciation for the way that that community takes care of each other. And in spite of, or in the absence of government systems, these are our family that supports each other. And so I grew up really understanding that community is survival, and that's something that we try to do in this program. So the first artist residency we launched was with Tanya Bruguera in the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And yesterday, while we were all sitting here, these women of the Mujeres Movimiento were out on bicycles in this very park, giving out information about trusted services from Immigrant Affairs, and in turn was talking to people that really need it and bringing back information from them. And they were specifically asking about housing issues yesterday. So like, what have you encountered from your landlords? What should the city know? How can we really bring that information back to policymakers? So this project was initiated by Tanya, and is a very collaborative project with the Mujeres Movimiento, a group of women and mothers and activists in this neighborhood that were born from Immigrant Movement International, in collaboration with Collective Migrantas, that's a participatory design collective that works with migrants around the world to create text-based information to make sure that that everyone has access to this like very important and critical information. So while this community is under threat, how are we really empowering them to be their own messengers and to have direct influence on policymakers? So the other residency I'll talk about, we have done 6 and 4 are currently underway, but I'm only going to mention these 2 today. So last April, we launched our first residency with the Administration for Children's Services with the Lost Collective, and they were specifically working at 5 LGBTQ youth homes. And these artists, Rebecca Radd, Britton Smith, Josh Ramos, and Keeley Gibson, are all queer, Black, Indigenous theater artists and activists themselves. And I don't know if you all are familiar, but the majority of youth that are in foster care are Black and Latinx, and about 40% of New York City's homeless youth population identifies as LGBT. So this is a very important population that deserves all of the things. So we thought for this 1 year, we'll put these artists in residence with these 5 homes with 30 youth, which is a really small scale for such a large agency. And we were thinking about scope in that way, like what does that mean? So we have the potential to really think about like citywide programming through this residency and how can an artist infiltrate all of the city. But what became really important was that these artists spent a full year with just these 30 individuals, really getting to know them and bringing that information back to Children's Services. So they were not just thinking about numbers and how to reach the most people, but really considering these individuals as people and their personal experiences and how that directly influence the policy that they create. So the artists worked with them in photography making, in autobiographical experimental videos, from dance classes to self-defense classes to voguing to like whatever was requested. The artists brought in either themselves or artist experts to really grow their network and build their community outside of these homes. And it was really transformational for a lot of us working on this program, including the youth. We had a final exhibition at the New York Poets Cafe, and it was really wonderful to see them see their own work and to see Children's Services staff see them as these like whole, complicated people and not just numbers in their deck. And we ended, I just want to read this one quote from one of the staff members who runs these LGBT homes, Jennifer Gunnell, was reflecting on this residency as it came to an end. And she said, "I think the Lost Collective offered an element of an antidote to the very heavy trauma that is so much a part of the system, from which the youth and even the staff suffer. We are looking for ways to mitigate that heaviness, open doors. Art immediately brought a lightness, making me ask if it is a human necessity the same way other healthcare processes are. Is art a way to decrease everyone's sense of trauma?" So the goals of Public Artists in Residence program is really to open free space for artists to work inside government, to privilege open-ended processes and socially engaged art over object making, and to consider socially and politically motivated goals as a value equal in weight to the aesthetic value of art itself. And I just want to end by saying that this whole program remains an experiment. Can artists work in government? Do they have the space to freely create without unwilling compromise and without the instrumentalization of their work for political or government gain? Can artists and art work inside government structures to shift, disseminate, or dismantle power so that one day we may all get free? Thank you.
Wrong slideshow. Next panel.
Sorry.
Should say.
Yes, we'll get to it. I apologize. I know. Sorry. Yeah, I apologize for that. Okay, here we are. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kanishka Raja, whose practice explores the intersections of representation, craft, technology, and the gaps that occur in the transmission of information. And of course, there's a much fuller bio in your packet, but we'll just get to it.
stopwatch. I was a tiny bit, hi, good morning, wow, more people here than I thought. I hadn't looked back for a while. Stopwatch, start. I was a tiny bit surprised to be on this, to ask to be on this, because I'm not an artist who has worked a tremendous amount in the public realm. And, I've got my sort of share of nominated or asked to submit proposals, etc., but I've certainly never sought it out. So I don't have a whole bunch to talk about or show, except for I'll talk about this one New York City-based project that I completed a year and a half ago, which was a Percent for Art commission from the Department of Cultural Affairs for a project inside a middle and high school right off Union Square on 15th Street, called the Clinton School for Writers and Artists, which is, I suppose, a magnet school? I don't know what the term is, but anyway, the school specially for writers and artists, which was kind of an exciting thing. When I got the commission, when my proposal was approved, this is what the site looked like. I was given tons of illustrations, renderings that looked like this to make my proposal. I immediately zeroed in on this site and location, which is as you enter the building in the lobby, and then to the left, here as you enter the glass doors, the library of the building, which was really the kind of central node of the entire architectural design, as I could tell. And also, just inspiring for me, A, because this was a school for writers and artists, and B, because libraries have been foundational in my experience of being a person. So, inspired by kind of visits and memories of ancient libraries, this is the ruins of the library at Nalanda in Bihar. Which was the biggest library in the world in the 12th and 13th century, it was burnt down, said. It had so many books that the fire apparently lasted 2 months or something. And just the romance of libraries in general and their idea of storing and transmitting information, and conflating that with other newer technologies and ways of storing and conflating information, including a kind of sense of games and sport, which is both a part of my visual vocabulary and for reasons I hope will become clearer, I used in this particular proposal inspired by this magnificent little story, which has been always inspiring to me, Borges's Library of Babel. I made a proposal, or I made a sequence of drawings thinking about all kinds of things directly driven by the model of Borges's text that ended up looking like this rendered and like this in its completed form. This is printed on the back of glass with mirror. So all the white lines you see are not printed, it's sort of mirrored. We can eventually talk about all the restrictions that come from working with a school and high school students, but I thought this is a text that they actually read in high school, I found out at this school. When I spoke with the principal. There's a quote from the text. For the interest of time, I'll go through it quick. I won't go through it. But this is what it looks like as you enter the library. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a QR code that you can scan the story onto your phone. I love the idea that this technology will become obsolete soon. Then there is a Dewey Decimal number for a physical copy of the book that exists in the library that the students can check out, which I kind of presented as an integral part of the artwork. They didn't quite believe me, but I gave it to them. What I didn't tell them was that I've actually made all kinds of drawings and notations inside the book. So it does actually exist as unique artwork. This is what it looks like from another view. There's a lot of ideas of infinity and reflection and mirroring and sort of looking that's embedded in it. My time is up. This is what it looks like. If you have questions about any of this afterwards, please feel free to ask. And that's it. This is the condition I was mostly in throughout the making of the process. Just to give you a tiny little anecdote, this is about 5 minutes before I left for the airport one day, approving, because I had to do an artist talk somewhere, approving how this was all going, and then got to the airport and got a call that they had dropped this 12-foot long panel and broken this entire thing. Which meant it took 6 more months to figure out how to make this. Thank you.
Artisan with gold.
So I have the pleasure of introducing Chitra Ganesh, who, of course, was one of the artists in the 2005 Fatal Love exhibition here at the Queen's Museum, and has been such a cornerstone, I think, of a lot of the South Asian contemporary art that scene and it's flourishing to the extent that it's flourishing now. Her drawing-based practice brings to light narrative representations of femininity, sexuality, and power typically absent from canons of literature and art. Her wall installations, comics, charcoal drawings, and mixed media works on paper often take historical and mythical texts as inspiration.
Good morning. So nice to see so many of you. Today I'm going to be talking about Index of the Disappeared, which is an ongoing collaboration between myself and Mariam Ghani. We met in 1999 when she was a college student at NYU and an intern at Exit Art through Sasi, and we began to be friends. We also had different opportunities before that to show at the Queen's Museum, and in 2005 we were invited by Melissa Chu to respond to the 2004, we were responding to the Republican National Convention. Artists were asked to make works about issues that were still not on the map and not part of public discourse. We both thought about what has been frequently referred to throughout this weekend of the emergence of the profiling of this community in a more intense way, a focus on singling out Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities. And we thought that in the wake of a post-9/11 recovery process for residents in the city, one of the things that I remember seeing a lot as I was walking around and trying to use public transportation and failing was a number of flyers, missing people flyers that were plastered all over the city. And one of the things that made me think of was this simultaneous, concurrent narrative of other people who were going missing, namely those who were being detained, deported, and sometimes were dying from neglect in their indefinite detention, and also the lawyers and activists who were working with them. So this is from our first project. We had a window installation and a video. So the three sites I'm going to talk about really here that we've used in our project are the window, the reading room, and then other forms of public space, including the internet. So, the window had been kind of a very seminal part of our work. So in this case, I made a series of watercolor portraits based on interviews, stories from activists and lawyers, some of whom were our friends, and this was just organically grew out of an interest and concern, and something we were thinking about and working on. We worked, at that time, we worked with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. They had been creating programs, temporary pop-up exhibition spaces in buildings in the World Trade Center area that had been abandoned and that were being renovated. I don't know the level of the participation now, but at that time Silverstein Properties was one of the properties who owned the World Trade Center building itself, and as part of the recuperation and the rebuilding, they gave out these kinds of gutted raw spaces for artists to do exhibits, and we had a reading room. So part of our work became to collect archival materials that were talking about different reactions to this time. Wow, that was 5 minutes? Okay. I'll just go through the projects really quickly. So, okay, that's fine. So we work in public libraries so this is at the Buffalo Public Library. One of the things we do is we take the materials from our archive. They generate text-based pieces. We include them with the circulating information in the library and build a new reading room. We also work using the window to create signage, drawing text fragments in a number of different languages, both in translation and in the original language, that talked about the idea of the beginning. This was during more of the beginning of the endless war that we are part of right now. So these are some of our different projects, and I'll just show you one more project. So this is another series of window installation. This here is a sign that would be put up in universities all over New York to alert students from the Muslim Students Association that they were being surveilled, because at that time there were informants who would infiltrate the meetings to try and kind of root out the terrorists. So this sign would be the key. So saying something and not saying something at the same time, this kind of relationship between opacity and transparency, between secrecy and openness, and the open secret as it operates in relation to all of the different forms of public policy that have changed. I'll just show you one last project really quickly. So how do I get to interweb? There? No. Okay. No, I'm not going to show that. There's no time for that. Yeah. So, in addition to the archive being a physical archive that's displayed in part or whole, and from which we draw inspiration, our work is also a platform a mobile platform for discourse, and we are interested in building the discourse around these ideas. One of the projects we did was organize a conference around the idea of radical archiving. So the 4 parts of that were around archives and absence. Then there was also archives and affect. And we also talked about archives and ethics. So for these conferences and conversations, we invited people not just from locally, but also from abroad. There was Lara Baladi came and talked about Tahrir cinema, which was happening in Egypt during the Arab Revolution. So the idea of using spaces like the institutions that we have access to, which may not be museums or may not be the street, but maybe something in between, is a way that we try to engage the idea of public address. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll ask next Shazia Sikandar to come. Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with her practice she presented yesterday, and who's really taken classic Indo-Persian miniature painting to another level, really expanding and playing with the sense of scale and experience. And I'm sorry that we have to see the work on these small screens instead of larger, but we'll have to all use our imaginations about how it feels to actually experience them as they were intended. But Shazia, would you like to go?
Hi everyone. So, very short time. I will probably just show two projects. One is temporary, one is permanent, and what that means. One came about because I have a studio in Times Square, the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts building. So I had insomnia for like a year, and I would walk around in Times Square after I'd take a break at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and I was wondering who were the other artists that were there, what was going on, and I had no idea that there was a Times Square Arts Alliance and that they did projects with artists. So anyway, through that information, I found out that you could actually apply. So I applied, and I was told that very few women actually approached them that are interested in doing media works. So I had access to over 40 screens, and I had this project called Gopi Contagion, which was up for the entire month of October in 2015 at midnight. So these swarms would descend at 3 minutes before midnight for that entire month. And what was so interesting for me was that these were like very important sort of like, you know, money, merchants, advertising dollars that they were giving at for artists at that intersection where you could engage through the technology as well as through the context of Times Square. So choosing what I wanted to show there was really about a couple of things. I wanted to access state-of-the-art equipment, so having access to the Google LED screens, having access to that scale, the space, shift of the work outside of the white walls, galleries, museums, outside into this sort of theater space which is recognized around the globe. So I was curious, I was like, I'd never done social media, I was engaged with animation and video, but it was all driven from drawing. So I was like, well, what's going to happen? So interestingly, I had done a piece for New York Times where I had focused on hip-hop and miniature painting as storytelling vehicles. So I saw this poster of Nasir Jones behind one of the buildings in which my work was also exhibiting. So I remember then reaching out and saying if you could, if you would Instagram it, and that started my Instagram. But what was also interesting is that with individuals that have 4 or 5 million people following them versus, you know, in the art world, getting a few thousand is a big deal. So it was always this kind of straddling of like who the work reaches out to. That was one of the paintings. So then the ominous nature of the hair. So people were thinking these were swarms. I had choreographed the piece by looking at basically it's the hair of the gopis, and I had taken them from another animation I had done, and I was also studying bats, because when I photographed bats, they looked uncannily very similar, and how that choreographed movement could be used for this ominous sort of presence of swarms that would descend on 40, 50 screens. Anyway, so then the other project, which is permanent at Princeton University, is I just finished that in April of this year, and this particular piece is a 66-foot glass ceramic scroll that takes that you can walk up over 3 floors. And for me, it was basically how to engage with the mortal bonds of humanity to the realm of the mind, and where all these natural forms, they dissolve in space. It's made of glass, ceramic, marble, ecstasy as sublime, heart as vector. It can be viewed in 3 sections, each with multiple interpretations and manifold references to history, religion, and literature. So the references are to flight, descent, material economies, spiritual transcendence. They invite contemplation, conversations. They were also inspired by Princeton University's late 16th century Pek Shahnameh, an archetype of the 10th century epic poem. Historical figures, spiritual events, natural elements. So these, the sort of image making, history, storytelling, all of these facets are incorporated into the work. So I was also interested in questioning that what is freedom within the economic global patterns which link all humans? And in my experience, creativity, I feel has no national, racial, or religious boundaries. It is the power of the imagination that fosters new discourse and it creates new frontiers. And in that respect, imagination is wondrous and it can't be contained and it cannot be defined, but with imagination also comes humility, inventiveness. And I worked with a whole team in Munich, and the piece was done over a period of over 8 months. A lot of the elements are also around the expunging of the female from culture, from religion, from political discourse. It's also the anatomical forms that I use, the cavernous sort of interior of the human form, almost exposed as a site of nascent renewal. So these, you can see the piece, it's up. It's in the economics department. It's also, what is interesting for me is that it's with all the other artists are like Alexander Calder, Gary, Henry Moore, Noguchi, Sarah, David Smith, Tony Smith, maybe 4 women, and in there is Louis Nevelson. So for me to have got this project, there was a whole sort of this discourse that, where do you fit, where do you become part of it? And it was an open call, so it wasn't like I was invited, I had to submit proposals. All right, thank you very much.
So our last presenter for this panel is Shagun Singh, who's an interaction designer, urbanist, and storyteller. She founded Urban Matter Inc. with her husband Richard Lin, who's also here, in 2012. And it's an interdisciplinary experience design studio that brings spaces to life by transforming environments into experiences through storytelling, data visualization, and participation. Please welcome Shagun Singh.
I'm Shagun Singh, and I run Urban Matter Inc., which is an experimental art and design studio out of New Lab, Brooklyn. I run this studio with my husband, Richard Lin, who's also here with my 3-month-old baby. So our focus is on creating large-scale urban installations that create awareness around the issue of urbanism. And we do this using design and technology, and there are certain techniques that we use to make our work. And these include data visualization, storytelling, creating interactions, and participation. So interactions and participation is a really big part of our work, and you'll see how we kind of manifest that in some of the projects that I'm going to talk about. So Silent Lights is a project which was commissioned by the Department of Transportation in 2011. It went up in 2013. It was funded by ArtPlace America, which is a creative placemaking organization and also a funding organization. And the piece was installed under the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in downtown Brooklyn. So what's interesting about Silent Lights is, if the video loads, let's see, is that it is a series of metal gates which are embedded with LEDs, and these LEDs respond to traffic noise. So all the noise is captured from the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and also from Navy Street on either side. So the louder the noise is, the brighter the piece is. And there are certain kind of light animations which are triggered based on certain decibel level of noise. So so the site is very important in this project because we are taking something which is really negative, which is how dark the space is, and how loud the space is, and we're converting it into something really positive. So all that commotion and that noise is being turned into these really beautiful light animations, which people who work and study or live around the BQE can enjoy.
I was one of them. It was amazing.
Thank you. The other factor here to think about is that it was a temporary project. So it was an experiment in how there is all this wasted space, millions of footage of wasted space under the BQ, and how it can be revitalized and repurposed for the community to enjoy. So again, an experiment, but we feel a fairly successful one. It was uninstalled in 2015. So all the projects I'm showing today are temporary. I'm not showing my permanent work today because it's actually interesting to talk about pop-ups and tactical urbanism, and I feel those projects are just so much more impactful. So let's hope the second video loads. So the second project that I'm going to talk about today is AirBear, which is really similar to Silent Lights in a way that it is a data visualization project again. So we are visualizing air quality data and not sound data. So just a second. Okay. So AirBear went up in Louisville, Kentucky in 2015. It was commissioned by Creative Commons, and it was commissioned or funded by, it was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we actually conducted a lot of community workshops for this project to understand what people's feelings were around air pollution, because we wanted that kind of engagement. We wanted people to have this conversation, and Louisville actually has one of the worst air quality in the US. What really came out of this conversation with the community was that people can't really see air pollution, so they really don't care about it. So what we did is that we set up these sensors, which we just saw. Let's see. So these sensors were set up to collect air quality data. Once we had this data, we actually visualized it as these small circles that you see on the screen. And people could kind of participate and pop these circles, so they're doing something with air pollution. They can actually see it. And all this data was juxtaposed on a real-time video feed off the street at the back. So it was kind of a virtual reality project in a way. And once you popped certain bubbles, some of them became pop quiz solutions. Some of them were games, so they were like gamifying this idea a little bit. Again, a temporary project, kind of circling around the engagement of the community, around the whole idea of air pollution using gamification. The third project that I'm going to talk about is PlayArray, which is again a project which was a pop-up on a storefront in downtown Brooklyn, and it is a game. It is a game board. We are obsessed with games. Now we have a little boy. So it is essentially a huge game board. It's a game of Pong, which has been installed on a storefront. So it was commissioned by the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress. And the idea around it is that there is just this massive gentrification which is going on in downtown Brooklyn, and there's a lot of empty storefronts. So how do you kind of get people to engage with their city again? How do you get people to look up again and not be looking down at their phones all the time? So you basically go to this website, playpong.me, you select a paddle, and then you can use your phone to play Pong with either the storefront or with somebody else, with a stranger. So you're engaging with the city, you're engaging with a stranger, and that was kind of the focus of this project. So it's simply a game, which is a really simple game, and it allows this kind of engagement with the city and with the community, and something which you wouldn't usually do. And we do it with like the simplest denominator by using one of the simpler games that people know around there. You don't need to know how to play Pong, you just automatically do. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to invite all of the presenters to join me at the table. We'll have a bit of a conversation. Probably about 10 minutes since we started a little on the late side. We have some time. So, as you can see, a very diverse set of ways of engaging the public. One thing that kind of struck me, and I think maybe you all can talk about it in different ways with your projects, there's certain projects that were really structuring how the public engages. So the game, the way that you interface it, you have a very particular kind of interaction in mind, and the interaction is actually the point where if you're thinking about the Times Square piece or the store or the windows, there's a particular way that people understand, like, how am I supposed to see, not touch, etc. That's already kind of part of the play. And then there are projects that really don't necessarily have the form in mind. It's something that's actually what you have to create, is a kind of interaction that doesn't exist yet, whether it's structurally, institutionally, that interaction doesn't happen, or whether it's, the idea of the library that you're bringing to a space has to actually be constructed by the materials and the design, and that's actually the work itself. So if you could talk a little bit about, maybe perhaps a little more in detail about that kind of interface and how you thought about the interface between the interaction that people were having with it, and how did you actually know how people are using it and how people are reacting to it, and is that important in your work?
This works. Okay, so for me, I had a certain kind of very specific audience in this situation, right? 13 to 18-year-olds. It came with 13 to 18-year-olds who were presumably there because they're interested in and are good at visual arts and writing and literature and all that. The project came with certain limitations because it's a public school in terms of materials and safety and all of those things. I decided early on, I thought, well, I do want some way in which there is incitement to discovery. The idea of libraries, first of all, is important to me because I've discovered so much of the world accidentally through discovery in libraries. And I wanted to embed some of that into the project. And so the clues to what that design and pattern is all really very directly related to the Borges story. So on some level, the hope is, if there's even one kid who's curious about what this is, whether they scan the QR code or find the book and read the story, whether it's stays part of their curriculum or not, that they will then have some kind of relationship to this giant green monolith that's in their face all the time. And the other physical aspect, the Borges story, Borges in general, has a lot of kind of references to infinity and mirroring and reflection and all of that. So mirrors were very important. But part of my pitch to the project was also always like, how else are you going to get 14-year-olds interested? You put a mirror in front of them, they're immediately, and it works. Like I didn't have the foresight to bring you images of the kids in front of it, but they are in fact constantly in front of it, taking selfies of themselves being reflected. And there's so many levels of reflection in the work that it is kind of optically destabilizing, and that kind of keeps them engaged. So,
it's interesting from the experience that we've had putting pieces in the city. You just can't take yourself really seriously. You can't take your piece really seriously. Our pieces have been used as scapegoats by skateboarders to just basically have fun with. At the Afropunk Festival, which happens very close to Silent Lights, it was used by vendors to basically hang their wares. So essentially, we do have an agenda always, but the way the piece gets repurposed is just usually out of our control. And I think in a way that is the beauty of putting the work out in the public. Like what happens if you put a stool out in the public, when people go and sit on it, stand on it, steal it, So it's always an ongoing experiment. That's what keeps at least us going as far as the work that we do. Yeah.
So for the sites that we use, which are often in some way interface either with the street or a community that uses that set of spaces, I think one of the ways we've understood and seen public engagement is happening in a very varied and layered way, so that it depends on who is in the space, but one thing that distinguishes those spaces from a museum or a gallery space is that they are used multiple times by the same people. So if it's an office building, a university, a library, a particular path that you take to the subway, that is different from, for example, my own experience of seeing an artwork in a museum, which is usually you come for one day and then you leave. So I think that sometimes the engagement is very superficial and sometimes it's a lot deeper and more extended. And so for that we have multiple forms of visual language. So there's signage, there's images, and then for people who want a much deeper dive, there's also text and reading. We did a project in the UBS headquarters, which is in Midtown opposite MoMA, and one of the things we did in our installation is we installed a couch, and we noticed that the 10,000 people who work in that building would often come downstairs to have their cell phone conversation, their breakup conversation, their lunch, and so just in creating a way that the space could be used also that didn't exist within that space automatically got people to engage with the materials that were a part of the installation. And we knew that they did because they would steal them.
One thing I would like to point out is that when I was thinking about the iconography for the work, there are certain motifs that I have used in the work which around the same period were being censored. So the motif of Miraj, which is the ascent of Prophet Muhammad in the representation of miniature painting, for example, is a very prominently placed motif in the piece itself, and it's rendered in a form that it licks up when there's light, and it sort of goes into, becomes like a black hole when the light goes off. It's a very empowering image. It's also an image which has become incredibly politicized. So for its placement in a permanent manner in that way, it has yet to gain. I'm sure there will be lots of discussions around it, but that was how some of the iconography plays a very significant part in the reception of the work in that particular history, which is very topical right now. And for the Times Square piece, of course, the openness of that space and how certain elements would be understood by a community that is not necessarily the crowd that usually comes to institutions or comes to your exhibitions. And so what happens at that time? How do you compete with the proliferation of commercial image making? And so my intent was to slow down, how to find a moment where everything is slowed and use that in terms of the nature of speed. So those were two very different things amongst other things.
So for our program, there are so many layers of engagement before it even gets to the place of having a public-facing project. So the first 3 months, at least, of these residencies are a research phase where artists just embed and get to know the agencies, and these city agencies are inherently risk-averse. So it takes a lot of time to build that trust internally, and we know that it's working because the artists can do the project that they propose. And then, so once like gaining all of that trust internally and really coming up with ideas together, they can do this project and create a structure for each residency that engages with a particular public in their own way. And it's so different from the Children's Services residency with only 30 youth to Immigrant Affairs, where they're trying to build trust between undocumented residents and the government, and the other way around is a massive population. So they really, in Veteran Services, we have a theater artist doing 65 performances over the next 2 years. So they're all really different, but they have so many layers of engagement before reaching the public or figuring out how to reach the public and interact with the public.
And I'll just say that people talk often about, sorry, all the kind of rules and compromises involved in public art, but the rules at a museum are so clearly inscribed. Everybody understands what the rules are, and they are so oppressive in so many ways that to say that you have to compromise to do a project with LGBTQ foster homes in Queens and Brooklyn, and you're not compromising when you're working in a museum, I find that's nuts, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's always rules. There's rules to public space as well, right? There's rules of like what kind of behavior is allowable, and you know, these kind of ways, new ways that people might utilize your piece in different ways than you imagine, or interacting with it in a way that you didn't imagine is part of the joy. And like I think that sometimes those limitations are actually can be a platform for the creativity. It's it's the screens. It's at midnight and it's for this long, and like that actually becomes in a way the kind of jumping pad for the creativity about it. And I feel like very few projects exist in a kind of like imagination and without like a vacuum of barriers. And like the other thing that I think is interesting is about the kind of scale. Like there's a sense of like, oh, I could reach this, the entire city, or all the employees of this building, or the thousands of people that are in Times Square, or I could make something the size of a building or the billboard, etc. There's this kind of amazing opportunity of the scale that is afforded. And then there's also this sense of intimacy that I think, that some of your work is, that it's that individual playing Pong, or it's that individual, interacting with that interface, and it's that sense of visibility of of data, et cetera, or the invisibility of certain people. Who are the people who are missing, who are not visible? So those are the other kind of possibilities that I really see coming out of the public sphere. And we don't have, unfortunately, too much time for questions from the audience, just maybe 5 minutes. But I think that all of these works are really playing with these kind of senses of, or scales of time and intimacy, and the kind of looking at the boundaries or barriers or challenges as the point of creativity. But I'm going to open the floor for questions. Over.
Hi, Tom. I'm just wondering if you could address how when we talk about engagement, obviously we're also addressing the issue of how lacking in diversity the art world is in the institutions and the cultural sector in general. And that's a direct threat to people who have a vested interest in keeping it fairly homogenous. And I'm just wondering, how is that expressed? Do you see the people who want to maintain it as a relatively overwhelmingly white sort of space? Is that addressed in your interactions with people who may, throw around buzzwords like diversity but don't want to change it? Or is it just a silence?
Yeah, so we did a study of all the groups that we fund. So it was required, so 1,000 groups sent in their information, and the results were that New York City cultural organizations are considerably more diverse than the country averages, but appallingly less diverse than the city. And it also, there were things like, the smaller institutions are more diverse than the bigger institutions. The single whitest job in the entire cultural sector is curators. The single least white job is maintenance and security. And so it's even within the statistics, there are appalling sub-statistics. My experience has been talking to institutions that people want to do something about it, but sort of, I don't quite know how to do it, the pipeline's not diverse enough, and all these kind of excuses you could say, so I think that there's at least willingness. And look, what I was saying before about the transformative effect of staff changes at the Queen's Museum, I feel like I get a lot of credit for leadership by, honestly, women of color, pretty much. And that was transformative. It made this place a more interesting place. It was more fun to work here. One of the things that they say about diverse staffs, it takes longer to make a decision. I would agree with that. But the decisions are better. So I think there's a lot to do. I think that there is some progress being made. And it's something, certainly, as long as I'm commissioner, we're going to be pushing forward on.
Prerna brought up the word scale, and that's something I was thinking of while looking at the presentations. Each of you chose a particular project, but uniformly I felt they were all quite large-scale projects, some quite technically complex, many of them requiring large teams, maybe with the exception of the Index of the Disappeared. And I know it's a small sample of what you're showing, but since it's setting the tone of a panel on public art, I'm wondering where small DIY projects, immaterial in form, maybe not needing permission of a city block or an institution, maybe not needing so much funding, but also by extension, therefore, not spectacular in form, sometimes very difficult to find. I'm thinking, for example, of Hope Hill's project, Whispering Campaign, which everybody complains they can't find it, because there are no signs, it's individuals, there's no marking. But I think he did something very specific, very anti-scale. We're familiar, of course, with Creative Time and the continuous larger projects that have been happening in New York City and elsewhere. So I'm just wondering about, you all made choices about what projects you showed. And what's involved in that choice, and what are you saying about the future of immaterial DIY projects that anyone can do, especially those without deep inroads into the institutions that some of us may have more access to?
So I'm going to take one more question, just for sake of time, and people can address whichever one, or two more questions, but make them very brief.
Dia, my question is addressed to you, but anyone could answer it, because you just brought up the issue of instrumentalization of art, and I think a lot of the public projects, often that's kind of a topic that comes up. So I was wondering if you could address how you resist that, or how maybe some of the artists have pushed back towards like the instrumentalization of public art.
Last one, I know it's a lot to keep in your head, but since we have a short period of time.
Thank you. I guess also towards some of the questions that have been raised, and this is to everyone on the panel who maybe brought it in there, is how you determine the rules of success for the different types of projects that you're doing, and especially the rules for success for perhaps a more permanent versus a more ephemeral project, and how that affects your decision-making process and your approach.
Okay. Anyone like to take any of those questions?
Yeah, I can start. So that remains a question for us, is how to stop the instrumentalization of art in this program, but also some of these projects are intended to have a life afterwards, like Tanya Bruguera's project with Immigrant Affairs. They created these materials, these text-based materials collaboratively so that they can be used for as long as they're relevant. So there's a need to, it depends on the project, right? So some project define success as like, can they have a life after me? And can it be taken by another community and made something else? And in that case, it's positive instrumentalization of work, but it's still a question. So we try to deal with that in like government language, which is contracts and laws, and what kind of rights do artists have to their work and to cease and desist after, and it is a struggle that we're constantly working through, so we don't really have an answer. And since this program is only in its pilot phase, 2 years, we're kind of seeing what happens with each one. But it's front and center of our life.
Can I also say that I think instrumentalization gets a bad name, right? If you're an activist and you want to change, some kind of measure is not necessarily the wrong thing. I think forcing you into a box is the problem. And that's what Dia and her colleagues are fighting against. Like the other agencies, like just, what services are you delivering? It's like, no, this is an art project, first and foremost. And sometimes it's valuable on an instrumental level not to call it services as well.
I'd like to take the DIY answer. So to the DIY question, most of the work and the technology that we build is like us, Rick and I. We started with creating or using open source prototyping tools like Arduino, etc., and then building these really quick prototypes that we could turn into public art projects. So Silent Lights was actually just a $5,000 commission, and it turned into a six-figure project just because we extensively fundraised for it, and we created awareness, and we kind of developed these kind of relationships with local organizations and people, and got the permissions and made it happen. So it was one of our first public art projects, but it totally came from the ethic of the maker movement, or the ethic of the do-it-yourself movement. Yeah.
Quickly, my version of the answer to Naeem's question. First, I chose to show this project because it's the only completed public project I've ever done. Second, if I could do a presentation of all the notational ideas of interventionist, small-scale DIY public things that I want to do better in my notebooks, that would take all day. And unfortunately, I will admit I'm culpable for not carrying most of them through, mostly because of just prioritizing other projects and time. It's something I've often desired, and maybe I'll someday figure out time to do it. But
I'm going to address Naeem's question also. I think what you express is very valid, and I also think that it depends on each artist's particular practice. In my situation, like, just all the work is done at a very small scale. It's done individually, so there was no team behind it. Basically, that's how I do the animations. Also, the very simple After Effects, and then theater of those screens allows a very large scale expression of sorts, which is again through the network of the Times Square Arts Alliance. So a very simple process, but in terms of its interface with the larger public, it's very elusive, because where exactly are some aspects of change that are going to happen. For me, it was access to incredibly expensive technology that I would not have had. So that's one thing. In the other project, the stakeholders were the economists that the piece was being that they chose out of several artists that they had invited. So that's behind the scene. But that's also within the gatekeeping of a lot of institutions and curatorships, etc. So it's not that different, but in the scope of how diverse is campus art in American universities, etc., or who gets to do public projects of permanent nature. These are very significant issues that need to be addressed, but then again, where, who? And so like even the smaller scale, more invisible patterns are even harder to bring to attention, to public attention.
So much of our work has been under like a $10,000 budget, and I think a lot of that has happened also, I mean, much of it has been like under a $2,000 budget, and I think some of that is through mobilizing our in-kind resources, like Mariam printed our photos for the Queen's Museum, for the Dhaka Art Summit at Queen's College and other things like that. But I think also, in addition to mobilizing the resources that we have and within the community, there are different layers, just like there's different layers of iconography and reference embedded within the work, there's also different scales of engagement within the work. So when we first started, one of the things we would often do is like give tours. So the idea of giving tours, the idea of making postcards that we gave away. So within the larger practice were smaller acts and also interactive, like the WARM database, interactive web archive, or Guantanamo Effect. I mean, those are other things that we did that I think would fall into the category of anyone can do in terms of how much money you have, and it's really just a question of, I think, time and energy. And like 14 years later, nobody has the energy to go and give the tour every day like one once did. So that's part of how that changed. But I think there's a layered engagement, and probably for many of these other projects.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks very much to all the panelists and for the questions from the audience. I'm sorry to wrap this up, but hopefully we'll continue these conversations more organically later in the day. So we're just going to take actually I forgot that we need to we'd like to welcome Jayshree Abichandani, who's the kind of instigator of everything that happened over the last couple of days, to do a little welcoming remarks now that everyone's here.
Actually, I'm going to turn the mic over to Lawrence and to Hui before I make any remarks. I just wanted to keep you guys seated and not moving between panels because it takes a few minutes, and we're going to use the few minutes to just say a few words. If we could start with Lawrence. And also just a couple of really quick housekeeping announcements. If you're freezing, I have an extra shawl for you. I brought 4 extra shawls. So let me know if you need shawls. I also have painkillers and pads, so if you need find me. And please, can you give a big round of applause to Lawrence Hui, because he is the one who has opened the door at the Smithsonian for the entire community. So he's going to talk a little bit about the project.
Thank you, Jayshree. I want to start by thanking everybody here. It's been really humbling and exciting to see the spirit of engagement and energy here, and I'm excited to see what this catalyzes, what comes in the days and the months years, hopefully. My center, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, does not have a permanent gallery space or a permanent collection. So we found ourselves facing the question, how do we operate as a museum without a museum? And traditionally the Smithsonian model has been bring as many tourists as possible to Washington, D.C. and come through our spaces, kind of primarily, secondarily, pump out traveling exhibitions across the country, and maybe thirdly, over the last 10 years, some hazy idea about use the internet somehow. And my center, thinking about communities of color, thinking about Asian American communities and Pacific Islander communities, is wanting to develop a different model. I think the last talk on public art and public engagement really resonates with some of what we're trying to think about. We don't want to just bring our shows or resources to communities across the country and beyond. We are wanting to think about how can we co-create together? How can we take our resources and work in conversation with communities to create museum experiences together? So we are really proud and excited to be able to support this convening, and to be able to support the exhibition, and to partner with the Queens Museum and the Asia Society, and to work with all of you. I think back to several years ago when I first sat down with Jayshree to talk about the possibilities of this project. And I remember her weeping with feeling. And that feeling was anger. It's probably not a surprise to those of us here who know her. A lot of that feeling was anger. It's equal parts anger and passion. And I felt humbled then, too, by the commitment and the service to community, to carving out space, and to wanting to actively build and create community. And so, for us as a center, this is a wonderful opportunity, and we are really glad to be a partner here to support this and to look forward to what comes out of it down the road. So thank you, and I will turn things over to Boon.
Hi, I don't want to hold everybody from coffee, so I just have two points to make. One is, I think as a person who's worked in museums for quite a few decades from Asia, I'm also very keenly aware wherever I go that this idea, the contemporary art museum, the White Cube space that we have, really is a product of European modernism and the Enlightenment, and it comes with a cost that it is a pure space that somehow those who are not endemic to that tradition, who come into that tradition later, or who challenge that, are in many senses purified out of that space. And a lot of the work that I personally believe in, and what I've tried to do always, and which is what I insisted when I came to the Asia Society, was that the museum must create spaces for local and regional voices, because all these kind of global, what we call global forces, global ideas, global art, I've said that at the opening, I hate those terms. They only make sense in the context that you're in. So part of it, what we're trying to do, and this is really the first instance of that, and again I thank Jayshree for coming to me with this crazy idea. We cooked up the show in a few months, which is ridiculous in New York terms. But it's really about passion, and it's really about faith in the strength of the diversity of talent in the city. Wherever you go, the diversity of talent. And I hope that this is, as Lawrence says, only the beginning, and with Asia Society, we hope this begins a process of going back to the Asia Society as a kind of convening for many different voices and different places coming together. And thank you again once more, I think, to the artists for really sharing your passion, for believing in this crazy project, for us coming to you like beggars in hand to say we have no money, but please, we can feed you well at least at the opening. So thank you all.
So I'm going to speak just quickly and briefly and I want to acknowledge a couple of people. So I have to say, this was such a beautiful, deep moment for me to be standing here with Prerna, with Dia, with Tom, and Kamal. Please stand up, Kamal. Kamal was an intern in the education department when I worked at the Queen's Museum, and she has worked on the convening with me, and she's been here all 3 days working her ass off. I want to acknowledge her. The other person I want to acknowledge is another Queen's girl, Nadia, who worked on the publication and edited everyone's bios for the publication to be here in time. I really want to give a shout out to Atif and Aisha from 12 Gates Gallery. Can you please stand up, Atif? Atif and Aisha have this fantastic nonprofit space in Philadelphia, and they have been kind enough to sponsor Faluda Islam's performance here today. So Faluda Islam will be performing courtesy of 12 Gates Gallery. And even though Icon Gallery is not here, I would like to give them a major shout out for supporting us and giving us space. Very quickly also, I know I'm a stranger to many of you who are here today, and I wanted to say to you that the reason Tom Finkelpearl is the only white man allowed to speak to us today is because he has proven time and again what an ally can look like. And he has not just opened up this space to us once, he has held the door open for all of us. And myself and Prerna and Dia and a lot of other women who have worked with him have really benefited from being allied with someone who gives us space. So I would recommend his model of allyship to all the white people in this room. I hope you do take me up on my challenge for giving up space to us, because that's really what we need. I want to thank every one of you for your brilliant presentations. I also want to let you know that today Makita Ahuja will not be able to join us on the painting panel, but someone who I originally had in mind, Malak Bal, will be able to join us, so it'll be a delight to hear from her. I don't know if I have much else to say except that it's a treat and a delight to be here with everyone, because when I moved here in 1984 as a 15-year-old girl, I lived about 15 minutes walking distance from here for 20+ years. And my father spent about 6 hours a day in this park for 25 years. He knows this park better than any park ranger can. And until Tom Finkelpearl came to the museum and opened its doors, nobody who lived in this area could access this institution. And so what he did was not just a gift for the local residents, it was a gift for the entire city to turn this museum around and to have this vision which is so responsive to our extremely diverse population of New York City. And I wish that other museums and other institutions would go about and make these interventions and make this systematic change and really reflect the population of the city and not just be these bastions of exclusivity. I hope that every one of us today really takes the time to build community with each other. One thing that's happening is that the Faithful Triangle, which is a panel which is due to happen in the afternoon, has only 3 panelists, so we're going to use that time to really open up the dialogue so we can talk amongst ourselves, because the framing of the panel really involves all of us. It is not exclusive to the Muslims amongst us, it is really about the entire community. So with that, I leave you. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're almost set, but Aruna, if you could